Traditional Arts Indiana's continuing webinar series that we offer. Basically, Traditional Arts Indiana is a statewide folk arts program that supports the artists and communities throughout the state of Indiana. And I'm really excited to be able to host this webinar, or to introduce our host of the webinar better. And we offered this once before, about a year ago, but we received a small grant from the Indiana Arts Commission to continue to do our webinar series. And I wanted to thank the Indiana Arts Commission for being able to make this happen, and as well as the National Endowment for the Arts, who help support the Indiana Arts Commission. We're really, really lucky to have here on the Indiana University campus one of the great advocates for open source scholarship and the Creative Commons. Jason Jackson is a professor here at Indiana University in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, and is widely regarded as a wonderful Native Americanist and student and professor of material culture and expressive culture of the Yuchi people. But in addition to that, he has been one of those folks who've been on the cutting edge of promoting open scholarship and the use of the Creative Commons. And so whenever I had a question about what are the Creative Commons, what types of licensing do I need to think about in the work that I do here in Indiana, he's my go-to guy, you might say. So I'm not going to eat up any more time, but I just wanted to give a good introduction and a thank you to Dr. Jason Baird Jackson for being here at Traditional Arts Indiana's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
Good morning, everyone. We're in Indiana, so it's morning for us here. Some of you are tuning in from around the world, and we're really glad to have you. I'm going to be speaking today about the Creative Commons. First, I want to thank the staff of Traditional Arts Indiana, particularly John Kay, its director, for beginning and initiating and carrying forward this webinar series. It's been a great opportunity to connect the work of Traditional Arts Indiana and of folklorists and ethnomusicologists and public humanities scholars in Indiana with colleagues and community members all around the world. And so it's just been a great project, and I'm really glad that we've got a good group today for our discussion of the Creative Commons. I'm going to begin, and the staff here is going to be monitoring the chat window. So if anyone has questions or comments or concerns of a technical sort or a substantive sort, they can share their questions or comments in the chat window. After my presentation is finished, then I'll join in the question and answer period. As John mentioned, we did this once before, and it was a lot of fun for me, and I think it was a success. So it's great to have this chance to do it again. So I'm going to be talking about the Creative Commons. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a technologist, and my background relative to this topic is a person who creates cultural materials. I'm a person who writes and makes museum exhibits and other kinds of cultural products. And I'm also an advocate for communities, particularly communities that don't have perhaps as much access as we in a university setting have to the fruits of scholarship, including scholarship about traditional culture and community life. And those concerns brought me into a domain in which the Creative Commons as a system, a cultural system, has become pretty important. So I'm going to be talking about the Creative Commons not as a lawyer or not as a technologist, but as a person who's interested in the fate and circumstances of traditional arts and of grassroots communities around the world. And so I suspect that most of you share those kinds of interests, and we'll be talking then about what the Creative Commons can do to help advance the kind of work that we're doing. And so this is me, a photo of me at least, taken at the IU Library. At the IU Library here at Indiana University, I'm involved in a number of projects that rely heavily on the Creative Commons. One of those is the Open Folklore project, which I encourage all of you to check out. And another is a journal that I edit called Museum Anthropology Review. As we'll see later, those two projects rely heavily on the Creative Commons, particularly Museum Anthropology Review, which circulates scholarship in the field of museum and material culture studies using the tools of the Creative Commons. And certainly the Creative Commons is increasingly important in the work that my colleagues here at Indiana do under the banner of Traditional Arts Indiana. So that's the context in which we're going to be discussing the Creative Commons. The first thing I would want to do is to point us to the notion of intellectual property. Um, we live in a time in which that term and concept occupies an ever greater amount of everyone's attention. So it's good to think for a second about what intellectual property is. From a legal point of view, in Western nations like Canada and the United States in particular, intellectual property is a domain which is heavily organized around formal legal concepts. And there's a number of categories of intellectual property that um, are relevant, some more, some less, to our discussions. At the center of our conversation today is going to be the notion of copyright. And we all recognize, I think probably recognize the little C inside of a circle, which has come to be the emblem of the legal concept of copyright. There's some other IP categories that we want to be mindful of, but we're not going to take up today. They include trademark, which is about organizational identifiers, patents, which have to do with inventions, geographical indicators, which relate to place of origin. For instance, think about champagne in France or feta cheese in Greece. And then the notion of trade secret, which relates to confidential business information. These are all either clear-cut intellectual property categories or what are called neighboring domains to intellectual property. Copyright is going to be our focus today, and copyright is all about creative works. And for us, there's a wide range of cultural creativity that could be bound up in the notion of copyright. And then we're going to figure out what we do to perhaps sometimes unbind it when it gets tangled in copyright. So relative to the kinds of concerns that the folks here at Traditional Arts Indiana have, and that the kinds of communities in which I work have, and that perhaps some of you work within, the domain we could call traditional arts and culture. Let's think of some examples where copyright could be at play, just to kind of ground our discussions. We could imagine a community anywhere, Canada, United States, New Zealand, any place, taking on the work of writing, let's say, a community history. Well, if a group of community scholars get together to write their own community history, under the copyright laws of most nations, that's going to be automatically copyrighted. And so it can, those authors can choose to put that little C on the front, but even if they don't put that little C in the front of their newly authored book or manuscript, it's still going to be under the laws of most nations copyrighted. And so it falls within the domain of a creative work that's protected through copyright law. Another example would be a documentary film or a creative photograph, or just any photograph we might take in the course of our field work or our collaborations in communities, or documenting or engaging with or producing and reproducing traditional arts and culture. A church cookbook, a newly composed song, video footage we might take at an event. These are all domains in which copyright is, as a consequence of the national laws within which most of us live, copyright is automatically part of the mix. And then thus, even if we don't know about copyright, it kind of knows about us. So we have to think about what to do. Now, I need to offer a kind of caveat here. Many folks who are engaged with in collaboration with Traditional Arts Indiana, or who are involved in traditional arts and culture work, get very interested in and concerned about music licensing. And all I can say here is that music licensing is going to need to be a topic for another day. That's a place where someone with a lot more skills than I was going to need to jump in. New musical compositions are obviously subject to copyright. They're copyrighted like a poem or anything else we might create. But music licensing is a kind of extra domain, right? The fact that on-air broadcast radio stations need to pay a certain kind of licensing fee to collecting agencies, and that's different than internet radio, which is different than what a restaurant needs to pay if it's going to play music in the background while it serves pizza. These are complicated music licensing and music business issues, which are a bit beyond me. The good news is we've got plenty, though, to talk about, and we're going to start with the notion of copyright. But wait, before we go too far with this notion of copyright, I am, amongst other things, a scholar of these matters, and to the extent that I can be, and it's important for us to realize that even if the lawyers we work with and the legislators who pass the copyright laws under which we live don't always acknowledge the fact, Copyright as we know it is not primordial. It is a thing that people created. They can change it, they can undo it, they could wipe it away, they can make it more or less useful to various constituencies. It's a human creation, and it hasn't been with us since the beginning of time. This is something that folklorists and those who work with culturally diverse communities learn firsthand, that not everyone in the world sees copyright as an inherently good thing. I don't, although I see its value as well. But more importantly, copyright is not the same for everybody, and it doesn't, from my point of view, doesn't need to be the same for everybody. But the reality of the situation in which we all in today's global world live is that copyright laws are an important part of the legal frameworks which we've got to work within. The Creative Commons is a response, one kind of response to that legal framework. But copyright was not here at the beginning of time, and there's no certainty that it will be with us forever. It's part of a historical period in which we live, and it's a byproduct of people doing things, making laws, which advantage and disadvantage various kinds of parties. So copyright is not ancient, and it's also not universal. Even though there's a tremendous push in the world to line up all the copyright systems of the world's peoples, that's the goal, for instance, of the World Intellectual Property Organization, as a one kind of international actor. Copyright is not universal. The laws of one nation are not yet perfectly harmonized with the laws of every other nation, so that there are variations from place to place. The situation in Canada is like, but not the same as that in the United States, and the same holds true as we go from nation to nation around the world. We do live in a time, though, in which there are powerful actors working to bring those legal systems into alignment. And there are reasons for that. There are business interests which are served, for instance, through the harmonization of copyright law internationally. The last thing I'll say about this is that legal copyright systems, like the US copyright law, they may not, they often don't, acknowledge other intellectual property systems. But that doesn't mean that those systems don't exist and don't matter to people. And I'll take up this theme very, very briefly at the end. But the point here is that intellectual property ideas can be found in all kinds of cultural systems. The Aboriginal people of Australia, or many Native American or First Nations groups in North America, and other peoples all around the world have long had ideas about ownership and appropriate behavior relative to not only property but ideas. That's the cultural diversity that I was evoking earlier. And just because international law has become a very powerful agent in people's lives doesn't mean that those other systems of thinking and acting towards the things that people create and the objects and phenomena that they understand themselves to own in very diverse ways don't matter. So as folks sensitive to cultural diversity, I think our community has a particular obligation to keep track of that diversity and to remind lawmakers and lawyers and others of these diverse understandings of creativity and ownership that exists in the world. Now, that said, we need to also figure out the way that copyright works. A resource that you could turn to if you're in the United States would be the US Copyright Office. The Copyright Office provides lots of basic information to help us negotiate US copyright law, and in most nations there's going to be similar kinds of resources. So all the comments that I'm making today can be kind of correlated with that, those sorts of everyday resources that we could turn to. So let me say something about the notion of the public domain and the commons. The public domain is a legal concept, and it's one that's of great relevance for folklore scholars and those others who care about traditional culture. The notion of the public domain is associated with works from a legal point of view which have passed out of copyright status. They once were subject to copyright, but they're not under copyright anymore. Let's say a book published in the 18th century is no longer governed by copyright, which means there are things that we can do with it that we can't do with a newly published work that's still covered by national copyright law. Related to the public domain, but a broader and less legally precise term is the notion of the commons. And the commons is an idea. It's rooted in physical space. We think about a village commons where everyone has access to physical space, or we think about a modern park in a municipality. We're thinking there about commonly held resources that are shared by a community or by all people. The notion of the Creative Commons is built on the idea that there should also be a kind of intellectual and cultural space in which there are things that we share with one another. So the notion of the commons is a kind of idea. The notion of the public domain is an idea codified in law. It covers some kinds of works, particularly those that have passed out of copyright protection. So that brings us to Creative Commons. The Creative Commons is an organization, and we're going to be talking now about its work, riffing on the single C inside of a circle, which we associate as an icon or emblem for copyright. The Creative Commons logo is this image I'm showing now with two C's inside of a circle. When you see that logo, it's a signal that a Creative Commons license has been used to help the creator of that work share it with others. And we're going to talk about how that works. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to be exploring the concept of the Creative Commons. The good news here is that the people behind the Creative Commons effort have been extremely articulate spokespeople for their idea, and they're very happy to explain it to you. I'm helping bring you into contact with that community and with those ideas, but they've made it very easy for me because they've made resources to help that work. They're very eager to make sure that their tools, the tools they're willing to share with you, are readily understandable and accessible. And you'll see a lot of Creative Commons materials I'll be sharing today. To begin with, I want to share a short film about the Creative Commons. In this film, you will hear one of the speakers refer to what he calls a new folk culture. And I couldn't help but share that phrase in this context because I'm a folklorist, and this is a project of Traditional Arts Indiana, a public folklore agency in the United States. And so whether we agree or disagree with the arguments made in the presentation, it's fun to try to figure out, well, what do they mean? What does the Creative Commons community mean when someone in that organization or associated with that organization refers to a new folk culture? What would a new folk culture entail? And for us, what does it have to do with not new folk cultures, right? What's the connection to older kinds of cultural practices and traditions that really matter? So we're going to first look at a new folk culture as evoked in this film called A Shared Culture, presented by the Creative Commons organization. It's a very short film that overviews the Creative Commons. And to do this, I need to do a little technical work here. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to start sharing this video, which is about 3 minutes. So hopefully everyone will be able to see the film online. If you have trouble with it, the Traditional Arts Indiana staff will try to help via the chat box. But I'm going to take a moment now and share this film. So I've stopped sharing my slides, and I'm now going to share a new document, the video called A Shared Culture. Here goes, and hopefully it's going to work.
What does it mean to be human if we don't have a shared culture? And what does a shared culture mean if you can't share it?
It's only in the last 100 or 150 years or so that we've started.
I'm going to pause the film just for a second to check to make sure everyone is able to hear it. Its sound is different than my sound. Great, it sounds like we're doing okay.
Tightly
Great.
restricting
So
how that culture gets used.
The internet enabled an infrastructure where anybody could participate without asking permission.
We have all these new technologies that allow people to express themselves, take control of their own creative impulses, but the law is getting in the way.
Creative Commons is designed to save the world from failed sharing. People who actually want to share stuff, who put it up on the web because they want to share it under certain terms.
So we wanted to create a simple way for creators to say to the world, here's the freedom that I want to run with my creative work. Here are the things you're allowed to do.
Can I reproduce it? Can I copy it? Can I put it in my textbook? Can I use that photograph? Can I make a new version of it?
Creative Commons gives tools to creators to make a choice about copyright.
Creative Commons license can cover anything that copyright covers.
Every license says, you need to give me attribution. I created this, give me credit for the work I did.
The basic choices are commercial use or not. Can you make derivative works, versions, adaptations, or not? And do you want me to have to share alike? So if I take your stuff, do I have to offer it to the next person under the same terms?
There's no requirement for you to do anything with your work other than what you want to do. You own the copyright to it. What we've done is given you the right to exercise your copyright in more ways, more simply.
So the idea here is to enable the creative impulses that the technology turns loose and get the law out of the way.
The work of Creative Commons is really about laying the infrastructure groundwork for this new type of culture, a new kind of folk culture.
Somebody from Delhi, somebody from New York, somebody from Singapore
Can feel comfortable using a photo that was created and given away by someone in the United States or in China or wherever that the licenses have been extended to,
with their identity being preserved.
which means that people can actually create new kinds of things, come together and build things.
Mashups that people can do with people's Flickr photos.
And CC Mixter has allowed artists to make music together.
It's really about creativity and connection.
Access and control.
From amateurs who simply for the love of what they're doing and they want to share it and they want other people to be able to make use of it, to commercial organizations.
In the end, this will have a very successful place in the for-profit economy.
Creative Commons is the bridge to this future. Is you got to move away from thinking about content to thinking about communities. Communities that develop around content, and the sharing that the licenses allow enable these communities to come together.
A physical commons is like a park where anybody can enter equally. A commons with intellectual works is actually much freer.
It really is going to be the pillar for communications between people, cultural exchange.
The space for more speech, more free expression.
And that's the kind of commons we're trying to create.
So there's the first of our films. I'll take a minute to stop sharing it, go back to our slides for a moment, and then we can keep moving. So that's an overview of the Creative Commons from the people who made the Creative Commons. There's a couple points that I would make at this point. One is that the Creative Commons, as we heard, builds on the notion of copyright as it exists in national laws around the world. The Creative Commons can be used as a framework in many different jurisdictions around the world. Increasingly, it's been tested and shown to do its legal work in those different settings. It doesn't erase or prevent copyright. It's a tool that lets people who create works choose to modify the terms under which they share those works. And so that's a theme that we're going to be exploring in the next section. Exactly why would you do that and what would that all be about? But the film's, I think, a good introduction to what the Creative Commons is trying to do as a project. And we'll be exploring a bit more. To kind of get us ready for that, I want to share one more short film. It's another one created by the Creative Commons community. It's called Want to Work Together, and it focuses more on the spirit in which the Creative Commons as a set of tools are used. Why is it that folks would want to share their work using this legal framework? And so one more video, and then we'll explore how to do it. So I'm sharing that second video right now. Seems to be working. If anyone has trouble, they should let us know in the chat window.
When you share your creativity, you're enabling people anywhere to use it, learn from it, and be inspired by it. Take the teacher who shapes young minds with work and wisdom from around the globe, and the artist who builds beauty out of bits and pieces she finds online, and the writer whose stories use ideas and images crafted by people he's never even met. These people know that when you share your creative wealth, you can accomplish great things. They and millions of other people all around the planet are working together to build a richer, better, more vibrant culture using Creative Commons. To understand Creative Commons, you need to know a little bit about how copyright works. Did you know that when you create something, anything, from a photograph to a song, to a drawing, to a film, to a story, you automatically own an all rights reserved copyright to that creativity? It's true. Copyright protects your creativity against uses you don't consent to. But sometimes full copyright is too restrictive. What about when you want all those millions and millions of people out there to use your work without the hassle of coming to you for permission? What if you want your work to be freely shared, reused, and built upon by the rest of the world? Luckily, there's an answer. Creative Commons. We provide free copyright licenses you can use to tell people exactly which parts of your copyright you're happy to give to the public. It's easy. It only takes a minute and it's totally free. Just come to our website and answer a few quick questions like, will you allow commercial uses of your work? And will you allow your work to be modified? Based on your answers, we'll give you a license that clearly communicates what people can and can't do with your creativity. You don't give up your copyright. You refine it so it works better for you. Welcome to a new world where collaboration rules. It didn't even exist just a few years ago, but now there are millions and millions of songs, pictures, videos, and written works available to share, reuse, and remix, all for free. Want to work together? Then join the Commons. Creative Commons.
All right, well, we'll get back to the presentation itself. Both of the videos we've just seen are accessible online. You can find them at the Creative Commons website. You can also find them in YouTube and probably other places online as well. So if you want to share them yourself with friends or colleagues, they're there for you. If you want to comment on them, you can do that. So there you go. So that was Want to Work Together, sort of the second of our two Creative Commons videos. So what I'm going to do now is actually get down into the actual doing of it and talk about the tools that the Creative Commons makes available to creators of content of all kinds, including I'll be mindful as I go of the kinds of work that I suspect many of you are involved in. You saw a version of this screen in that second film. It's a part of the Creative Commons website where it helps us license our work, and you can see the URL for this page up at the top of this screenshot. Basically, the Creative Commons folks have worked really hard to make very simple, easy to understand tools to help us make choices about how we want to share the things that we create. And of course, these tools also enable other people to similarly share their work in ways that we could then build upon in the things that we might want to do. So that you may need a photograph for a project that you're involved in using. If someone else has licensed that photo using the Creative Commons system, you may then be able to use it without needing to seek out special permission from that creator. That's just the kind of work that was being evoked in the films we just saw, and we can both contribute to and draw upon those kinds of resources using these tools. So here we have License Your Work, and basically it shows you how you can make a few simple choices, and the Creative Commons website will walk you through these choices and help you arrive at the decision that's right for you. And so a place to start is this page called License Your Work, or Choose at the Creative Commons website. When the Creative Commons people talk about licenses, they're in essence talking about an additional agreement that you're entering into with the world, in which you're specifying how it is that you would like to share your work, building on the tools that copyright already provides you as a creator. And they speak about three kinds of licenses, or three layers of licenses. One kind they call human readable, and that basically means that you will have access to a deed or a document that very clearly specifies in ways that non-specialists, non-lawyers can understand what it is that you're agreeing to, and that other people can understand without being lawyers what it is that you're willing to let them do or not do with the works that you might create. Underlying that very straightforward legal explanation is actual legal code that's keyed to various national and international copyright laws. In other words, there's lawyerly language that hides underneath the human readable language that folks like I can make sense of. But there's a third layer that we want to be mindful of, and that's what is referred to here on this screenshot from the Creative Commons license page. It's called machine readable. And the idea here is that we should be able to share our work in ways that take advantage of the capacity for computer technology, for software and the internet to help us share more easily. So that if we want to make a photograph available online and we're willing to share our work with others, we can do so in a way that helps others find it by marking it up in a way that a computer can help that other user find your work. And a simple example of this would be the ways in which a project like Wikipedia or photos that we might make available on a site like Flickr can be marked up in such a way to indicate that the content is shareable under the terms of a Creative Commons license. We can read that in human terms, but there's metadata, there's code hiding underneath those works in such a way that the machine itself can help us find the kinds of works we're interested in. And if you'd like to know more about this side of things, the Creative Commons website provides a good bit of background. So now I want to talk about the ways that Creative Commons license can vary to give you a range of choices. The choices are not so great as to be infinite, but they're broken up in such a way that different projects, different people with different needs can make the choices that are right for them. Just like that little C inside of a circle is a kind of icon for the idea of copyright, the Creative Commons characteristics, the characteristics of a Creative Commons license, each have a kind of corresponding icon that's designed to very simply convey to us the notions that are at issue. And the first of these that I'm introducing to you is the notion of attribution, which we could simplify with the simple English word by. Who is this work by? And the idea here is that Creative Commons licenses keep track of and enable us to protect our status as the creator of a work. All 6 of the Creative Commons licenses that I'm going to be describing for you build in the notion of attribution. If you are a person who doesn't want to have credit attached to your identity, you can, in essence, commit that work automatically to the public domain. That's something we'll be talking about later. The icon that I'm showing now with the 0 inside of the circle, that's the icon for that idea. And we're going to come back to that later on. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, there are 6 variations on Creative Commons licenses. And right now we're talking about the BY or the by part of it, which means that all 6 Creative Commons licenses all ask future users of a work to give credit where credit is due to the person who created it. And that's what the attribution or by element is all about. Here's an example of a relevant project in which the by designation is being used. This is a film that we can find on YouTube. It's called Baskets Made with Desert Images and Materials. It's a short video made by Voice of America about Native American basketry. And it has been released into the world under the terms of a CC BY license. That means a Creative Commons attribution license. What that means is that all that Voice of America is asking of those who encounter this film is to give them credit as the producers of it. You can incorporate it into all kinds of new projects of a diverse sort as long as you give credit to the original creator, in this case, Voice of America. That's an example of the by or the attribution element. Another part that fits into Creative Commons licenses, and it's the first characteristic that divides them into groups, is the non-commercial or NC characteristic. We see here the US dollar sign with the line through it saying no commercial uses. Some users of Creative Commons may wish to not allow commercial use of cultural materials that they're responsible for creating. And so here I've divided those 6 licenses into those that do and those that do not allow for commercial use. If we think about a folklore example of this, the Yuchi people with whom I work place a lot of attention on the notion that their traditional culture is such that works that are based on ancestral knowledge shouldn't be commodified and turned into money-making products. That idea could be expressed through a non-commercial license. And there are 3 variations on Creative Commons licenses that attend to this non-commercial interest. At the same time, there's lots of people involved in the Creative Commons community who very much want to pursue commercial work. And so there are licenses available to them that allow for that. Here's an example of a non-commercial license in use. I found this photograph on the photo site Flickr, and it's an image of a thing called the Museum of British Folklore. And I don't have any idea what this is about, except that this is obviously a a curiously painted travel trailer called the Museum of British Folklore, and someone has taken a picture of it at a folklore festival, I think, and then they're sharing this photo under a BYNC license, which means that we have to give attribution to the creator, and if we're going to use it, we can only use it in new projects that are non-commercial in nature. Here's another non-commercial license. This is a page from Museum Anthropology Review, the journal that I edit, and this is an article by our host, John Kay, and it is released to the world under a CC, that means Creative Commons, BY, that means attributions, SA, we'll come to that in a minute, that means share alike, and then NC, non-commercial license, which means that you can do things with John's article as long as under its terms they're non-commercial uses. That brings us to this notion of share alike. You can see the little arrow in a circle inside the circle, share alike, or abbreviated SA. And the idea here is that creators can require those who use their work to then in turn license their works or derivatives of their works under the same terms, or not. They can go in the other direction and not insist upon sharing alike. So there are two kinds of Creative Commons licenses where this share alike clause can be evoked. That's in essence your way of saying, I'm sending my cultural material down, let's say, a non-commercial pathway, and I insist that those who use my materials stick with my intentions on that point, so that the BYNCSA attribution non-commercial share alike license is your way, for instance, of insisting that those who build on your work do it in the non-commercial way that you may want. Here's a share alike example from Wikipedia in which attribution and share alike as a feature is highlighted. So this article on the cuisine of the Midwestern United States from Wikipedia was licensed at the time that I read it under this particular version of a share alike license. And it's an example of something that we could use ourselves in our own work as long as we stick to the terms intended by the creators at Wikipedia. Here's another variation on the license scheme. It's called no derivatives, abbreviated ND. This breaks the licenses into two groups, those that do and those that don't allow derivatives. And ND, the two ND related licenses here on the one side of this slide, the right hand side, are the no derivatives allowed. And basically what you're saying when you use this license is of a license of this sort is that you're willing to share it, but you don't want people turning your stuff into something new. So it's a pretty restrictive version of the Creative Commons license. But here's an example of it. I had to look a little bit to try to find this, but this is an example of a klezmer tune played online by some artists. I don't know exactly who they are. They were willing to share their work out there in the world. I mean, we could listen to it, but we're not supposed to take it and remix it into something new. So it's a relatively restrictive kind of Creative Commons license. Here they're saying that we have to, if we're going to play it, we're going to have to give attribution. We can't use it for commercial purposes, and we're not supposed to make derivatives from the work. Now, those are the key characteristics of a Creative Commons license. I want to speak now about how we might engage with the public domain. I mentioned this one earlier, the idea that we can dedicate a work, send it directly into the public domain by using what's called this CC0 waiver. And basically what we're saying when we do this, and the Creative Commons provides us this additional tool, is that we're not at all worried about any of the stuff we just discussed. We just want to send our creative work out there into the world, and anybody can use it any kind of way they want, and they don't even need to give us credit. If we had a reason why we wanted to do that, and I can think of some, then this waiver tool allows us to do it. In essence, it's saying to the world, hey, I know that copyright gives me a whole range of rights, but I'm not interested in exercising them. I want to give my work away to the fullest extent possible. Here's an example of using that tool. The University of Michigan Library has been a very active entity encouraging open scholarship and the use of things like Creative Commons licenses. They're behind a lot of projects that we here at Indiana are also very involved in, things like the Hathi Trust digital library. Well, when the University of Michigan Library creates resources, let's say like catalog records, whenever possible, they dedicate those right into the public domain so that anybody can use them in the freest way possible. If you'd like to learn more about how the Creative Commons, the University of Michigan is using Creative Commons tools that way, they're profiled on the Creative Commons website, and the University of Michigan Library itself has resources to tell the tale of what they're up to. There's additional tool, this C with a line through it, which is in essence a way of, it's just an icon. It's a way of signaling to users that you have done the work before you share someone else's work to show that it's in the public domain. Here's an example from here in our home area. This is an older book, Abe Martin of Brown County, Indiana, by Ken Hubbard. And I chose this work because it would be of interest to John Kay, our host, who does research and who is from Brown County, Indiana. If we go to the Internet Archive, which is an amazing source of electronic resources, particularly digitized books, this is a work that is not in copyright. And it's available then for us to read, but also to use in a wide variety of ways. And if we wanted to make it available with a little icon to help clarify that status, we could use that little C with a line through it. So that this is a work that's no longer subject to copyright. And so we don't need to use a Creative Commons license to circulate it because it's no longer covered by copyright. And we can take this text and use it in other out of copyright works in every imaginable way to move forward. Now, I want to offer a coda before ending, and that is that if we start with copyright, the Creative Commons in essence is a system of tools that sits on top of copyright. It in essence builds on what's implied in copyright to allow us as creators to offer our works to the world under diverse terms, more flexible terms, and as users of things that others create, it helps us reduce the friction that comes along with sharing. If we want to use somebody's photograph, we don't have to ask them if they've already told us ahead of time that they're sharing it under the terms of a Creative Commons license. What I'm introducing just in a small way with this final slide is a new system that's being created right now as we speak, which provides a different set of tools to help communities, including and particularly kinds of communities that are of special concern to traditional culture and grassroots community life, and to public folklorists and others who work in that domain. And I'm specifically mindful of indigenous communities, the kind of communities that I work in most often. These are new tools that are being developed around the idea of traditional knowledge licenses and labels. Like the Creative Commons, these are ways of signaling to others the status of the creative works that we might circulate. And they're particularly tools designed for the needs of indigenous communities, but they can be applicable to any community which wants to share understandings based in local cultural knowledge, local intellectual property concerns with those who may not be fully aware of the cultural understandings that go along with the kinds of cultural creations that we might want to circulate. And so that the traditional knowledge licenses and labels are being developed by a group of colleagues that I work with, or that I know, Jane Anderson and Kim Kristen, and these licenses are being built particularly in the context of a database tool called Mookadoo, and I urge you to go online and to the website that I've listed here on this slide and check it out. But I just wanted all of us to be aware of this new set of tools which are coming online right now to help indigenous communities and others package and communicate cultural understandings related to traditional knowledge in ways that are like but different from the tools that the Creative Commons is providing. And so that brings us to the end. I want to thank of the formal part. I'm going to thank John, Chad, and Caitlin for organizing the event today, the Creative Commons for the tools that they do use and make available to us, and to all of you for coming. I think we've got time, hopefully for most of you, to raise some questions. So we've got a good group here. Maybe we could talk about the projects that are of special interest to you, or I could clarify points that maybe I didn't cover in the best way in my prepared remarks. I'm going to tune in now to the chat window and see what the conversation there is shaping up to be. Well, I want to thank John and Chad for sharing those links to the 2 films that we watched earlier. Oh, I see. Okay, so hi, Susie. Your question is, does commercial purposes include books? If someone uses my oral history interview in a book and people have to pay for it, is that identified as commercial? That's a really good question. And there's it's tricky. One reading of that would be that if your book was published by a nonprofit publisher, it's conceivable that it could be thought of as a non-commercial entity, right? A not-for-profit publisher still may need to pay for paper and ink and printing presses and whatnot. And thus, one reading of that would be that if you circulated your oral history interview using a Creative Commons license that allowed for non-commercial uses, that let's say a university press or an oral history center that was working in a non-commercial way could use it, but a large commercial publisher couldn't. Now, that's a simple answer, but it's maybe not an airtight answer. This is a matter of perhaps the greatest debate right now in the Creative Commons community. I'm not on top of the debate, but I'm aware of it. Right now, there's the set of licenses which I shared with you and which are available for us to use have the characteristics, I think, that I've tried to describe for them. But there's some work going on right now to try to refine those licenses, to move to a new set of versions of those licenses. That doesn't mean that the old ones won't be available, and it certainly doesn't mean that they wouldn't continue to operate the way that they've been described. But fundamental to the discussion that's happening right now on the development of new licenses is to try to clarify exactly the matter that you're raising. What are the boundaries of commercial purposes? And there is a point of view, and it's not exactly my point of view, but there's a point of view that's part of that conversation which is encouraging the larger community to avoid at all costs using these non-commercial qualified licenses. This point of view says that if the goal is sharing, we shouldn't add on these new hindrances of commercial or not commercial. Now, I sort of represent an alternative point of view, which says there are good reasons why we would want to preserve the non-commercial commercial distinction. And I gave you an example of why that was a moment ago. There are communities that want to share their cultural materials, but that have strong cultural preferences or ideological commitments to non-commercial ways of doing that. So my view would be that we have to find ways to make sure that the non-commercial characteristic is available and that it's made workable. The alternative view centers on the idea that commercial strategies are sometimes the best or easiest way to circulate knowledge. And if you need an example of what this would look like in a kind of ethnographic mode, we can imagine a university in the developing world in which there was Creative Commons materials that were available to students, but there was no internet. And the only way that anybody could find to make those Creative Commons licensed teaching materials available to, let's say, local students in that that college or university in the developing world would be to incentivize some local entrepreneur who has access to a photocopy machine to make up copies of those teaching materials and bring them to class on the first day and say, hey, I've got the workbook for the class. I'm Joe from Joe's Copy Shop across the street, and I'm selling the workbook for $5, and you can purchase it and have the things you need for the class. This image is one in which a commercial route to circulating Creative Commons licensed material might be the only practical way in which to make it happen. And if the goal is to get resources in the hands of people, hindering the commercial option from this point of view is seen as detrimental to the end goal of making creative works available. So I can entertain the case for both sides of it. My own sense is that I hope that there's a retained commitment to the non-commercial side, because there are situations in which that's the only locally appropriate way to move forward. And obviously your question, Susie, relates to this, right? You may want to share your work in non-commercial ways. And my view is the whole point of the Creative Commons is to make that choice of yours possible. So I hope that that answer helps. I see that Barbara has a question about permanency. Let me see if I can deal with that. And then Elise has a question following up on that. So Barbara's question is, are Creative Commons licenses permanent, or can they be altered over time? My understanding of that is that you can re-release a new version of your work under the terms of a new license. But if you send it out in the world with a certain license attached to it, that version you've sent out contains the characteristics that you've set up from the get-go. In other words, the license goes with the version that you release out into the world, but you could, in essence, redo your work and change that license. Now, one way that you can change a license after the fact that I would want to highlight is that let's imagine that Susie released one of her oral history interviews under a non-commercial license, but Barbara or I or Elise or somebody else wants to do something commercial with that. It is still perfectly normal and reasonable for us to track Susie down and say, hey, Susie, you released this interview using a non-commercial license, and that was obviously the right choice for you. But let me tell you about the commercial project that I would like to use your work in and see if I can gain your consent to use that in this other way, which wasn't provided for under the terms of your license. In other words, we can still go back and renegotiate with those who have released their works using under the terms of one license to try to achieve something that might not have been allowable under that license, so that you still have the underlying copyright and thus you retain the rights to enter into new kinds of negotiations around your work. I hope that made sense. That was my attempt at Barbara's good question. Let's see what Elise has to say. On related question, how does the notion of derivatives apply to oral history? If I quote from someone else's interview in my own study, is that similar to remixing music? Yes. Now, the only thing about quotes is that there's that neighboring issue of fair use, which is so important to so many scholars. We've been relying for a very long time, longer than copyright, on our ability to encounter the scholarship of others and draw upon it for the ideas that it possesses and to quote from it where that's appropriate. And so that there are the customs in scholarship, for instance, of citation and referencing the work of others. And on the other side of things, our anxieties and frustration around the space we call plagiarism. So at one level, those kinds of concerns are going to be present in the mix, and I haven't been addressing them. With respect to derivatives, as in a general sense, the notion of derivatives would apply. I mean, it is a way, remix in essence is a way of thinking about derivatives. The idea that we're going to take the cultural stuff that someone has created and draw upon it and use it in new ways. In this case, new ways that are going to be governed by the terms of a Creative Commons license. So when we do talk about derivatives, we are talking about something like what remix means in music and other cultural domains. Now, one of the tricky things about oral history has to do with, and the kinds of ethnographic interviews that folklorists often do, is oftentimes the way that things are expressed are specific to the speaker, and we want to honor their role in crafting those words. At the same time, if you think about oral history, the idea that there was a big fire in Chicago, or that the Civil War deeply impacted the people of Virginia, right? Those notions which are embedded in an oral history narrative are separate from the ways in which they get expressed, for instance, in someone's oral history interview. So I hope that is a bit of a extension of the matters that Elise is asking about. I'm glad that that Susie found the answer helpful. Let's see what Thomas has to say. As a field worker and oral historian, I've found that knowledge is produced in those situations from all participants. Are all authors of the resulting work? How does Creative Commons account for multiple collaborative authorship? That's a really good question. Let's imagine an oral history interview or an ethnographic interview. Presumably the speaker that we're interviewing as a researcher is not the only voice in that conversation. It's not a monologue. It's going to be a byproduct of not only of the questions and the answers, but the conversation that often flows in the human encounter that we think of as an oral history interview or an ethnographic interview. And so, yes, all of the parties to that interview would be, in essence, co-creators of the results, and thus they would all have a stake in it as a creation. Now, you could partition it into parts. In other words, the interviewee could retain the copyright in the things that they said, just as the interviewer could retain the copyright in the things that they said, like the questions. But it's probably more likely that we're talking about a group effort and that we would want to think about ways to characterize the fruits of that encounter as a joint effort in which the parties all have a say in what goes on forward from that work. And so we could, if we didn't have the access to the Creative Commons, we still would be thinking about this under the terms of most copyright law, right? What would be the status of an interview under copyright law? And then what the Creative Commons does then is gives us new tools. We can enter into an agreement with our interviewee, for instance, to arrive at a shared understanding of what the best way forward would be, perhaps using the tools of the Creative Commons. So I hope that helps. Elise asks a follow-up question. Does CC work fall into the public domain according to the same criteria as traditionally copywritten work? My understanding is that it does, because it's built on local copyright laws. So whatever the relevant copyright law in the United States would apply to a work that I create and license under the combination of U.S. copyright law and the Creative Commons license that I chose. And Canada would have some variation, and other jurisdictions would as well. But there's a editorial comment worth making here in connection with the question that we're talking about now. U.S. copyright law and the laws of other nations as well have been changing in such a way that the idea that materials would leave copyrighted status and enter the public domain has become more and more fraught. The terms, the government of the United States, for instance, has regularly over the last 50 years extended the term of copyright in such a way that the term covering works keeps getting longer and longer, and thus less and less becomes eligible for the public domain. And if you're interested in this, there's a lot of work on the subject of copyright and copyright reform. The Creative Commons arises out of the legal concern that I'm evoking now. And if you need a kind of clear-cut indication of this, think about the early works of the Walt Disney Corporation. Those works have not entered the public domain because the laws that envelop them have been rewritten so as to extend the applicability of the copyright that applies to those works. And so as we think about the question, how long is this going to last for me if I circulate a copyrighted work that I've created using the Creative Commons, because it relies on the underlying local copyright laws, if the terms of those copyrights are retroactively extended, then we can't be certain that the work will eventually enter the public domain. That is one of the reasons why some people have chosen to short circuit copyright altogether and speed up, in essence, the public domainification of their work by dedicating it from the get-go to the public domain. Elise, I hope that helps. Or Susie, I'm not sure who asked that question anymore. No, it was Elise. Yeah. I'm glad that there was something useful for you, Thomas. Thanks. Oh, Thomas has a question now, but it does seem as though Creative Commons is rooted in traditional ideas of individual authorship as in authority, but I'm not fully conversant with the emerging, evolving approach to copyright. I think that it's true, what Thomas is evoking here. The Creative Commons is a workaround in which the people behind the Creative Commons would like not to overturn copyright law in jurisdictions like the United States, but they would like to see it modified in such a way that returns it to an earlier perspective from their point of view, in which its job was not simply to protect the financial interests of creators, but also to promote the advancement of knowledge and the fostering of human creativity. The argument that many Creative Commons activists would have would be not that copyright is inherently bad, but that it's broken, and that the current copyright system, by, for instance, reducing the size of the public domain and expanding the realm in which copyrighted works are protected for longer and longer periods, that hinders our ability to use copyrighted material for the common good, to create new works, to advance knowledge and related endeavors. And the idea here is that if we go back and look at the history of copyright in jurisdictions like the United States, it was in essence a tool that was designed to promote creativity by giving some special rights to the creators of new works. But that was done to promote the common good so that those works would be available to everyone. And so Thomas's question is a good one. The Creative Commons builds on the in essence, the notion of copyright that we actually have, but its architects are aiming to encourage us all to think about copyright in a way that is more in the public interest. That's a different perspective, for instance, than those that are baked into the notions of traditional knowledge licenses that I evoked at the end of the slide, in the next to last slide. If you approach this the way that an anthropologist or a folklorist might, you might say, you know, the whole idea of copyright is the problem. Can't we develop a system that that approaches matters outside of the terms of copyright? But that's a challenging thing to do, given the fact that we all now live under pretty strong national jurisdictions all around the world, in which copyright is a powerful legal system that's hard to push against. The Creative Commons represents one way to try to tweak the problematic aspects of copyright at the same time that its architects are also trying to encourage changing the underlying laws. So Thomas is asking a good question. I hope I did justice to it. Oh, well, I'm glad. Oh, yeah, Thomas is in essence raising the question of individual identity. It's certainly the case that when most of us think about copyright, probably our default setting is the kind of creative genius fiction writer who alone in their study creates the great American or great Canadian or great world literature work. But of course, that's not the way that this has to go. In many domains, collaborative authorship is really, really normal. And you don't need the Creative Commons, in essence, to approach authorship in a creative way, in a collaborative way. We can think of all kinds of vernacular cultural forms which are a product of a shared creative activity. But even in the world of big science, we can look, for instance, to the domain of high energy physics. If you look at a scholarly article written in the domain of high energy physics, the people that go to CERN in Switzerland and crash atoms into one another, if you look at their articles, you'll see that there are oftentimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of authors listed on the title page of those scholarly works. And they're all, in essence, sharing in the copyright in that work, as well as in the creation of it. And that's the custom in those areas of science in which collaboration is, as it is in so many vernacular communities, so much a product of group work. So anyway, the copyright and individual authorship don't have to go hand in hand, even if our kind of de facto mental images assume the kind of sole author model. So Thomas is raising good points. Are there other questions, comments that folks would like to share? Trying to squint and see the chat window and see what folks are thinking and talking about. Elise is typing. Oh, well, thank you, Elise, for joining us online. We've probably come to the end of our time. I'm happy to stay here chatting, but if those of you who are online with us need to head off to your busy days, I just want to say thank you for joining the webinar. And on behalf of my colleagues here at Traditional Arts Indiana, I'm really appreciative of the time you spent with us. Good luck in your work, Oral History Center. Thanks, Elise. Hey, great, Barbara. I'm glad that it was useful. You're all very welcome. Thanks, Greg.